So let me talk to you a little bit more about soldiers. 1882, the Mercury comments on the growing number of dancing houses in Lichfield now that the barracks have arrived, and suggests that they are neither moral nor peaceful, and it is the duty of those in power to crush them out at once and forever. Chief Superintendent Herneman agreed, linking the dancing houses to what he called sad cases of girls being found in hovels with soldiers. And he stated that many girls who went to dancing houses were prostitutes, in fact. Other trouble from soldiers. We had in September 1883 several soldiers causing an affray at the Cross Keys Inn, breaking windows and assaulting the landlord with a belt. The bench noted that the soldiers were becoming unbearable, and the chief superintendent reported that military police were no longer provided to help the constables. With yet more soldiers expected to arrive, it was agreed that he should write to the barracks for assistance. Right, so I'm going to break down a little bit now. Not me, the reports. The superintendent might have got the support he asked for because incidents fell over the next few years. New laws on the age of consent and brothel keeping were also passed, and 3 reports on brothels were made during 1885 to 86, one of which the Mercury directly attributed to the new laws. There were a few mentions of underage girls, although one girl, first arrested at age 14, did not reappear in court till she was 18, and that might have been due to the act. 1888 was also the year of the Ripper murders. Nationally, these generated an awful lot of interest, but in Lichfield, the events passed almost completely without comment in the Mercury. On the 14th of September, the Mercury commented only on the shortcomings of the Metropolitan Police in not catching the killer. In that year, 1888, 7 of 23 reports linked to prostitution took place between September and December. And unusually, 4 of those were in December. And this might be for the same reason that the Ripper murders were actually partly made possible. That the new laws from 1885 that were closing down brothels meant that people didn't have a permanent place to live or to work, and had to basically be out on the streets more. This made some of the more vulnerable women effectively homeless. And in London in particular, it drove them into the worst streets, which made them easy prey for the Ripper. And in Lichfield, the same law might have meant that women who would have been working indoors in the winter, so to speak, were forced to earn a living on the streets. During 1888 and 1887, Sarah Thacker accounted for 9 of those reports. Mary Averon from Rugeley appeared from 6, and other girls had come to the city, probably attracted by the barracks. Some had stayed. Many had no local address, leading to convictions for sleeping outdoors or in outbuildings. But despite the arrival of the soldiers, during the entire study, there were never more than 24 reports linked to prostitutes in any one year, in a city of over 8,000 people. By 1889, as you can see here, the reports were falling again. They didn't rise really until the last couple of years of the study. From 1889 onwards, incidents involving soldiers were also decreasing, just over 2 per year in the last 8 years of the study. So although the soldiers may have attracted women in the first instance, apparently soldiers don't pay very well, and perhaps having got wise to this, some of the women moved on. One girl interviewed as part of a study in prostitution in London said, "After a bit, I went to Coventry and took up with the soldiers as was quartered there. Soon got tired of them. Soldiers is good, soldiers is, to walk with and that, but they don't pay. Because why? They ain't got no money." So by the last 2 years of the study, low crime rates in Lichfield were being matched across the country. By the late 1800s, a number of industries had finally set up in Lichfield, including some foundries and a bicycle manufacturer. And in 1896, a tradesmen's association was formed in the city. 1891 also saw the demolition of some of the worst houses in the city in Baker's Lane. So perhaps these changes, along with the national decrease in poverty levels more generally, had helped to address local poverty a bit and also contributed to a general reduction in the crime rate. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how things played out across the year. Given that arrests are mostly for things like public disorder, it's not surprising that most reports are made in the warmer months, May to October. May, you've got your annual Lichfield Bower, apparently an attraction for tourist excursions. July, August and September also contained more reports. The annual peak is perhaps a bit surprisingly in October, and this might be linked to troop movements at the barracks or to other factors, like the seasonal nature of market gardening, so one of Lichfield's largest economies. So autumn harvests might have been one of the last opportunities for higher wage packets in the year, and so perhaps people were treating themselves to a bit of a final fling. The weather, obviously, might also have contributed. The second highest reason for arrests was girls sleeping outside or in outbuildings. And people who weren't from Lichfield may not have had lodgings that allowed them to bring customers home, or they might have been homeless. Carrying out transactions in a field or under a hayrick in the cold of winter might have been completely impossible, or at least extremely uncomfortable. One report describes Sarah Thacker found sleeping in a shed in February 1894 and very ill from exposure. The report notes that if she hadn't been found, she would doubtless have been dead by morning. Arrests were always for offending public sensibilities in some way, so anything that went on quietly behind closed doors was not going to be reported. So it's possible that prostitution continued less publicly in the colder months. Or perhaps the homeless girls went elsewhere in the winter. Lichfield had a reputation for having a lot of charities, and the city's large share of market gardening was apparently partly because seasonal workers were happy to support themselves via the local charities during the winter. By the 1860s, there were complaints that there were too many handouts to the poor, and it was having a degrading effect, leading to an ill-conditioned surplus population. In 1885, the mayor claimed that a scheme to provide employment on the roads had been shunned by the unemployed working classes, who expected to be given charity rather than employment. And so the women and their men may have been able to take advantage of these charities in the winter, which might also explain the dip in incidences in the colder months. But as I have mentioned, prostitution itself was not the issue, and the reports described in the Mercury tend to show Lichfield wasn't really unduly concerned with prostitution. Only 4 reports in total related to soliciting, and only 5 to brothels, most of these following the 1885 Act that made it possible to fine brothel keepers. The single biggest offences, with 75 reports, were public drunkenness and disorderly behaviour. Sleeping outside, linked to vagrancy, was also high, and beyond that, the next most prevalent offences were obscene language and indecent behaviour. So arrests, as you can see, were made to preserve public order. Lichfield was proud of its low crime rate, and it wanted to regain some of its former status. So this policing of public space was vital. Having pointed out the local low crime rate, it would not do to have public spaces marred by disorder, no matter how petty that might have been. Bigger places, so London and Liverpool, for example, were able to contain prostitution within certain areas where brothels were accepted and prostitutes were rarely moved on. Lichfield had pockets of poor housing, but unlike larger cities, the slums could never be far from the city centre, so separating safe public spaces from areas of vice may not have been possible at all. So public prostitution then was perceived as a nuisance, and the Mercury confirms this, labelling women as a great nuisance or a complete pest to the neighbourhood, for example. Reports of women sleeping outdoors or in outbuildings were accompanied by concern for damage to property or to crops, for the impact on the city rather than the impact on any individual. When flowers were destroyed in Rotten Row, authorities told the 2 women responsible that they were determined to put a stop to the doings of people of your class. And in 1892, the mayor noted that damage was continually being done to his fences by that class of people. So it's worth taking a little bit of a closer look about who that class of people might be. So I did a couple of case studies on a couple of the women who appeared in more than one report. And I've mentioned the notorious Sarah Thacker a few times. She was Lichfield's most prolific offender. She was responsible for 52 out of the 225 incidents that are recorded. Her career stretched the full length of this study, from when she was aged 23 up until she was 41. And it's very likely she'd been arrested several times before my study begins. As early as April 1879, they called her a shameless woman who has figured many times in court. It's also clear that she was summoned more times than was reported. In August 1893, they reported as her 50th occasion before the court, and the Mercury described it as Sarah's Jubilee, which was nice. Sarah was married. Some research suggests that this is unusual for a street prostitute, and it certainly does seem to be unusual in this study across Lichfield. It seems likely that for Sarah, prostitution was a part-time activity to supplement her family's income. She was also one of the small numbers of Lichfield natives in the study, and she had a child, which again was also unusual in this study. She spent some time homeless, including a time where she and her husband had separated, and she also wasn't beyond using physical violence to settle disputes with her husband. Her periods of homelessness are a good indicator of the poverty of some who turn to prostitution. Social research at the time shows that low-paid employment often led to prostitution where women could work shorter hours for more money. Other studies have shown that street prostitutes were generally from lower paid occupations, such as domestic servants and agricultural labourers, where employment might be seasonal. The Mercury recorded occupations for only 6 women, 3 of whom had been domestic servants, and the others a weaver, press worker, and a laundress, so they generally fit the patterns of low paid work. Sarah's husband John was a labourer, and he was possibly also seasonal or poorly paid. On one occasion where Sarah was reported as homeless, John had been sentenced to 3 weeks jail for vagrancy only a few days before. Sarah and her family were recorded living at various addresses in Lichfield for the next few years, during which time she served at least 11 jail sentences and received 11 fines. In November 1889, John Thacker moved another woman into Sarah's home, and Sarah, recently released from jail, was no longer welcome. John got a bottle over the head for this action, and Sarah got another arrest. In the census of 1891, Sarah was recorded living with her mother in Lombard Street and working in the fields. Her mother was a widow and on parochial relief. In both 1892 and 1894, Sarah was again arrested for vagrancy, though by 1896 she once more had a Lichfield address. And she clearly lived a very chaotic lifestyle, and her income must have fluctuated greatly over the years. Not altogether clear what happened to her daughter, Mary Ann. In 1883, John Thacker was arrested for keeping Mary Ann, who was then aged 9 or 10, away from school. Under the Industrial Schools Amendment Act of 1880, children of prostitutes or who were found in brothels could be taken from their mothers and committed to such schools for residential training for future employment. And just as an aside, note that these schools were intended to teach people how to become future servants and manual workers, so they knew how to serve the upper classes. It wasn't equal opportunities education at all at that stage. John didn't return to court with Mary Ann as he was expected to, but neither did Mary Ann reappear in the Mercury during this study, so she may have been committed to the school as the magistrates had required. Sarah's activities were reported in much greater detail than any of the other women, and it's probably because of her attitude. The Victorian public were fascinated by scandal, and although her antics were not headline material, they certainly livened up the police reports quite a bit. In 1887, she sent back a court summons with a note written on the back, which said, "Dear sir, please take this paper and make the best of it, for you won't have me." The reading of this note caused considerable amusement in court. It also may have suggested that Sarah was literate, although she may not have written that herself, obviously. In 1888, she told the court that PC Charles Buckley was a respectable friend of hers, which made the court laugh again. And in another session, she announced to more laughter that the reason she'd been frequenting the blacksmith's shop was that she and the blacksmith's mistress were in love. On being sentenced to 1 month imprisonment with hard labour, she told the magistrate, "Thank you very much, sir. I can do that standing on me head." And again, everyone laughed. Sarah's relationship with the city and its inhabitants was complex, and that reflects in the reports. She was vexatious, she was entertaining, and at times she even elicited sympathy. On one occasion, the bench pointed out to John Thacker's mistress that she'd been living with Sarah's husband while she was in jail, and they gave Sarah a more lenient sentence as a result. And when Sarah appeared very ill from exposure, they treated her much more gently. Most reports, though, present her as something far removed from the accepted standard of a woman. And so this complex relationship may explain the great variation in Sarah's punishments, from month-long jail terms to several occasions in the middle of her career, where charges were dismissed entirely in return for a promise that she go sober. Such promises never lasted very long. The magistrates may just have had no idea how to control her, and being uncontrollable might have been her biggest offence. The Victorian writer Bracebridge Hemming interviewed an ageing prostitute in his study of prostitution in London, and she had this to say: "I don't think much of my way of life. You folks has honour and character and feelings and such can't understand how that's been beaten out of people like me. I don't feel. I'm used to it." I did once, more especial when my mother died. I heard on it through a friend of mine who told me her last words were of me. I did cry and go on then ever so, but Lord, where's the good of fretting? I aren't happy either. It isn't happiness, but I get enough money to keep me in victuals and drink, and it's the drink mostly that keeps me going. You've no idea how I look forward to my drop of gin. It's everything to me. So, I'm going to contrast Sarah with Mary Averon, who originally came from Rugeley, and she was unmarried and she was childless. She arrived in Lichfield in 1885, shortly after the new barracks were built. Between 1885 and 1887, the Lichfield Mercury reported her in 14 court appearances, although, like Sarah, she was clearly convicted more than was reported. Arrests were largely for things like drunkenness, obscene language, sleeping outdoors, and causing an affray. In court, Mary was often defiant. On her 19th conviction, when she heard her jail sentence, the Mercury reports that she shouted out that she could do that and she would be ready for them when she got out. In May 1886, she alleged that two soldiers she had met and drunk with had later dragged her into a lane and raped her, one of whom was blowing a bugle at the time to drown out her cries. The soldiers were acquitted in July of the same year. Only 6 weeks later, she was arrested for having tried to commit suicide by throwing herself off a canal bridge. On that occasion, it was a soldier who rescued her. Mary asked for time to write to her mother, but as the superintendent noted on later conviction, Mary's letters to her mother were her usual story. Despite her seemingly tragic stories, Mary seems to have been treated less sympathetically than Sarah Thacker was, perhaps because she was less entertaining. Mary disappears from the Mercury reports in 1888 and 1889, before returning with a man in 1890. Her few appearances in the newspaper of that year, including a drinking spree in the company of Sarah Thacker, and an appearance as complainant after her new partner assaulted her, and he apologised for this in court, and that apology must have been accepted. By the census of 1891, Mary was living with that man in Burton-in-Trent, occupied as a hawker. Whether she supplemented this with any sexual commerce is unknown. Some contemporary reports maintain that most prostitutes in England were absorbed into the so-called respectable classes, and this may have been so for Mary. There isn't enough evidence for a detailed study of the background of all of the women in this study. Those discussed above were amongst the most prolific offenders and so the most notorious, according to the Lichfield Mercury. But what does seem to be clear is that they were completely accepted by their peers. The idea that the working classes in particular accepted women working as prostitutes in their midst is not new. Writers at the time report that prostitutes frequently became wives and mothers and were received on equal terms by their peers. And in a very small town like Lichfield, where numbers of women working as prostitutes appeared low, and where even the slum areas were practically in the city centre, it may have been easy for women to interact with everyday society in a relatively normal fashion. So the perception of prostitutes as a nuisance in the city does seem to be very different depending on the class of the observer. So, in conclusion, from the number of offences and from the way reports were made in the Mercury, it seems that although prostitutes themselves might have been a bit of a pest, prostitution wasn't really that big of a problem in Lichfield, at least through the lens of the newspaper. Of course, that isn't going to be the whole picture. Court reports weren't lengthy, not every related incident was reported, individual reports differed, and as you've seen, people like the entertaining Sarah Thacker got far more extensive coverage than those who were less amusing. Some argued that police court appearances themselves were manipulated by police and authorities to portray certain pictures, and that only certain women were ever brought before the magistrates. And this could be true of Lichfield, given the small number of women that emerged in the study, despite the proximity to the barracks. Some of Superintendent Herneman's remarks also indicate that he had seen and discharged women before their court appearances. And the paper doesn't give any significant coverage to reform work that went on locally, other than some allusions to the charitable works taken by the bishop's wife, Mrs. McLagan. If women who were deemed savable were managed out of the process, then these filters of managed court appearances and nuanced reporting could present a particular slant on the subject, which would influence public perception. So, whether newspaper, police and authorities were colluding in presenting artificially low reports on crime is a question I can't answer. But in Lichfield, it may not have only been difficult to segregate areas of the city, but also difficult for criminal or nuisance acts to remain anonymous. Other larger cities were able to regulate prostitution to some extent by containing it in the worst residential areas and were considered rife for prostitution due to high populations offering greater anonymity. Any cover-up by authorities and media in Lichfield might have been much more difficult. Residents may have had a good idea of what was happening locally, regardless of what was reported. It's interesting that in Merthyr Tydfil, a small town though much larger than Lichfield, residents used the correspondence columns in the local newspaper to direct police attention to vice-related activities. But in Lichfield, concerns about such matters appear to be entirely absent from the correspondence columns. So this may be an indication that the residents didn't consider public prostitution and vice to be a problem in the city, or at least not one worthy of correspondence in the paper. What went on elsewhere, behind closed doors, where it caused no offence, is another question entirely. And speaking of questions, that does bring me to the end of this presentation. So if there's anything you'd like to ask, then... I've just been asked how big the police force was at the time. I could tell you exactly if I looked it up, but off the top of my head, I think Superintendent Hernman was the chief, obviously, and then there were 2 constables beneath him. When they merged with Staffordshire, that dynamic changed a bit, and I can't remember exactly how it changed. Yes. Yeah, definitely.
You mentioned the fact that Lichfield seemed to have concluded that it had a low sort of crime rate, but doesn't that become sort of self-fulfilling? I mean, you alluded to that. I mean, I got involved with Labour government in Blair Brownlow, the National Indicator Centre. There were all these numbers that the people in the target store. You had to point out that some of them, it was easy to hit. All you had to do was not report.
Yeah.
So is there an indication that Lichfield's figures were lower because it decided that its figures were lower?
I think that could have been part of it. And yes, you're right. I did mention that sort of managed court appearances do make a difference. And Lichfield wanting this status and also wanting to compare themselves to Walsall, Wolverhampton, you'd very much think then that, yes, that could well have been going on. I think the thing, again, that I couldn't really find the evidence on, but the idea that people were being managed out of prostitution by being diverted away into sort of different things by the charitable works, that I'm sure would have come up an awful lot more. But it wasn't reported on at all. So I feel that something was going on there that's would have, cast a different perspective.
About those charitable works, I'm interested in what they were.
There isn't much detail about them. That's why I can't really tell you much about them. But they, many places set up these things, and as I say, it was the bishop's wife, Mrs. McLagan, and the idea was that they would sort of have almost like schools that they could divert people into, which would give them training that would fit them into different types of employment, and in some cases divert them entirely out of the area if that was a thing for them, because they might have family somewhere else as well. So that was the sort of thing that was going on, but I just couldn't find the evidence to back up what I'd got. Oh yeah.
It should be cash on the governing body of the workhouse every 2 weeks. She had to account for it, give to the deserving poor of Lichfield to keep them out of the workhouse. He retired in 1870. In the 1870s, he was succeeded by his son as relieving rights for Lichfield. So his son would be relieving Lichfield during the 1870s. It would have come into conflict with a lot of these punch.
Yeah. Certainly, I imagine they were sentenced to the workhouse quite regularly. So yeah. They weren't really linked to a specific crime. It seemed to be more how they appeared in court on the day. So Sarah Thacker is obviously my main example. For almost identical offences, she could be sent to jail for a week or for a month. She could be given a fine. She could be let off. It depended entirely on sort of the sort of context and circumstances around it at the time, and also I think how annoying she was being at the time as well. That seemed to make a difference.
Which jail was it?
It was It was mostly the workhouse, I think she was sentenced to, but I think
So if the magistrate sent her to jail for a week,
I think it was Stafford.
it would have been.
Yeah.
So was it basically incarceration rather than hard labour?
It depended because she got the workhouse as well, but yes, she got jail too. So
How big was
I don't know. I'm sorry.
How big was the work? Oh, it was pretty good. The building mostly split. That's Johnson. Something. Yeah, the building line road on the yeah. They're the building. The reception building built in 1839. Yeah. When my great grandfather was born.
I mean, I found that the age of consent had been 12, in fact, from 1275 to 1875.
Yeah.
Pushed it up 1 year and then pushed it up through that. Because I've been researching. Yeah, I mean, she took up with something, and it was not in any way illegal. I mean, it might have been seen as unseemly and questionable. I mean, attracted by publicity, but there was nothing whatsoever illegal about it.
Yeah, that's right.
One thing, an indelicate question. How did these people avoid pregnancy?
It is. But
It's a concomitant of the business they're in, and it would have been disastrous for them.
yeah, and you saw from the information I got that very few of them had children. There was only really Sarah Thacker in the study who'd got children. When that was only one child.
You can't rely on the man, surely.
No, I wouldn't have thought so. I'm given that prostitution has been sort of such a viable thing in this country for so long.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure there would have been methods,
Yes.
but I'm not, not fully conversant on what they are. I'm sorry.
It needed
I know that Casanova used to use a pig's bladder, but
Yes.
Use a pig's bladder.